Okay, let's begin our discussion in a little bit more depth about human structure. And I want to first talk about the um, the atomic level of structure, of human structure. When we talk about the atomic level of structure, we're talking about the basic universal matter. Okay, we're talking about carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. Those four atoms are the most common of all atoms in a living organism. We have additional atoms such as calcium, phosphorus, sodium, potassium, okay? But by far the most common are these here. We'll address this a little bit more when we get to chapter 2. We talk about chemistry. All right, so what happens is all of these different atoms will bond together molecularly. They're joined together, form chemical bonds, and when they join together, they form the next level of organization called molecules. These would include things like water, glucose, which we can write as C6H12O6, sodium chloride. Okay, so all these are examples of molecules where we've taken individual atoms, each atom with its own unique chemical and physical property, then binds or bonds with another atom, and collectively then, as they're bonded together, we get new physical and chemical properties. Uh, and that's what molecules are. If we take a look at our diagram here, this here is the atomic level, and this here is the molecular level. Now we can expand on the molecular level, and we can actually create what we call the macromolecular level. And the macromolecular level is when you take individual smaller molecules and you join them together to make even bigger molecules. For example, DNA is a macromolecule. DNA is composed of three main groups of molecules. We have a sugar, we have a base, and we have a phosphate. Now, it's different than a phosphorus. Phosphates have phosphorus as part of them, but they also have oxygen and hydrogen as well. Phosphate. There we go. Okay. That's one example of a macromolecule, DNA. Starch or glycogen, which are carbohydrates. Glycogen, which are carbohydrates, are big, large chains of sugar molecules joined together. So when you're taking the individual molecules and joining them together to make much larger molecules, those are macromolecules. Okay, so here's our first two levels. So here's one, we'll call this 2A and 2B here as well. All right, the next level of organization, which is right here, is called the organelle level. All right, and what we do with the organelle levels, we take the atoms that made molecules and the molecules that made macromolecules, and we join all those together to form these organelles. And these organelles would include things like ribosomes, mitochondria, Golgi bodies, endoplasmic reticulum. All of these are structures that are actually found within the cell, that they're made up of molecules and macromolecules. And it's all of these structures then that allow a cell to function. Now, one of the things that we're going to start to see now is that as we move from level to level, what we're going to find is that each of those things at a level of organization have something in common. And in this case, even though each of these structures has their own unique function, collectively what they do is they allow the cell to, they function to keep the cell alive. And so what we can say then is we have all these different organelles, each with its own different function, yet when they're working together for a common function, then what we have is a cell. And that's really what we have. We have groups in a cell, we have groups of organelles that function together for the good of the cell. And that's what a cell is. Now there's hundreds of different kinds of cells, upwards of 200 different types of cells based on shape and size, functions, all that. And we'll address that as we go through the semester. So here's the cellular level. Here's 4, here's 3, here's 2B, 2A, and level 1. And what you can see is that we're building up on each level. We're taking with the most simplest, and we're making something more and more complex as we move up this level of organization. That's a very important concept to understand, is that we are getting more and more complex as we go from the simplest level up to the organismal level up here. Alright, the next level of organization is the tissue level. And what happens is we take those different cells that we talked about in level 4. Here's the tissue level, level 5. What happens is we take those different cells individually. They have their own unique structure and function, but when we put them together to create, when we put them together and they function for common good, then we call them tissues. There's 4 main groups of tissues. We have muscle tissue, which consists of cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and skeletal muscle. We have epithelial tissue. We have nervous tissue. And we have connective tissue. Now we address these in more depth in Chapter 5. You'll also be looking at a lot of these in lab. So while each of these tissues then has its own unique function, muscle tissue for example, even though we have different tissues in there, all those are involved in movement in some way. Epithelial tissues are involved in protection, absorption, secretion, so your skin, your glands, the inner lining of your gut are all made up of epithelial tissues. Nervous tissue is involved in communication, and connective tissue is kind of a hodgepodge of tissues actually, but really it's involved in support and, like the name implies, connection. So connecting a lot of different tissues and cells together. Now, what we can do is we can take these different tissues and we can lump them together based on a common function to create what we call an organ. So for example, if we look at the stomach, we are going to find in the stomach, we're going to find muscle, specifically smooth muscle tissue. We're going to find a layer of epithelial tissue, and then we're also going to have a layer of connective tissue before we get to that smooth muscle. And then we're going to have another layer of connective tissue and another layer of epithelial tissue. So if this is your inner part of your stomach here, if we went from the inside of the stomach to the outside, we would have epithelial tissue, connective tissue, smooth muscle tissue, additional connective tissue, and more epithelial tissue. And we also have in there, we have a nerve supply as well that goes to the stomach. And this is basically how every organ is made up, is that we have different tissues that are grouped together, bound together, connected together to create that particular organ. And even though individually these tissues all have different function, they work together then to create the overall function of this particular organ. And the function of the stomach is digestion. It secretes hydrochloric acid, it secretes enzymes, it breaks down proteins, it begins the process of mixing the food that you've eaten and chewed up, and eventually releasing that into the digestive tract. So even though all these different tissues, in a general sense, have different functions, collectively they are working together for the overall function of the stomach. Now, level 7 is the system level, and this is where you take different organs with different functions and they are all grouped together with a common function. So even though individually these organs in these systems are going to have their own unique individual functions, collectively they are working together for a common function. All right, again, example, digestive system. The digestive system consists of the esophagus, the stomach, small intestine, large intestine. You also have the tongue, the teeth, you have salivary glands, you have digestive glands, you have the liver, you have the gallbladder. Each one of these organs has their own unique functions, very specific. However, when you put them all together and they're working all together, the ultimate goal then of all these together is to break down the food you eat so that we can ultimately get the nutrients out of that food and to our cells, because they use those nutrients as fuel, as building blocks for repair, for making new cells, for making new molecules, etc. The final level of organization really is, I guess it's kind of a level, and that is the, I guess we could say, level 8, and that's the organism itself. So here's level 8, the organism itself. And so the organism itself consists of the different systems. I'm not going to write them all down, but as far as systems are concerned, we have the muscular system, the skeletal system, the nervous system, the integumentary system, digestive system, the cardiovascular system, the respiratory system, reproductive system, immune system, the endocrine system. I think I'm leaving one out, but all these different systems function in their own unique way, but yet they are all working together to keep that individual organism alive. So even though these different systems have different functions, they are working together. If I were to ask you the question, rate the importance of the different systems from the most important to the least important. And you could spend hours working together and coming up with a list and trying to justify why you think one system is more important than another, but really it's a trick question. All systems are equally important. There is no one system that's more important than another. They all work together. We need all these systems to work together to create a healthy living organism. And that kind of leads into a topic I'm going to be talking about shortly, and that is a topic called homeostasis. And that it basically looks at how the different systems are working together and how the different systems respond to changes in the internal and external environment to make sure that these systems then are working together. The last thing I want to mention, and this is important, is that the lowest level of this level of organization, the lowest level that we can have and still consider something to be living, is the cellular level. And I mentioned that earlier. So we can have single-celled organisms that are still considered living, but beyond that, the individual organelles are not living, the macromolecules are not considered living, neither are the molecules nor are the atoms. But when we put all these 4 levels together, or these first 3 levels together, we do get a living organism. Alright, so that lowest level of organization where something can still be considered living is the cellular level.